All right, today we're jumping into a powerful and honestly a pretty unsettling argument from Professor Amos Mentz's work, The Hypocrisy of Memory. We're going to break down his analysis of how we remember history, and maybe more importantly, how and why we forget. So, let's dive right in.
Professor Menza kicks things off with this staggering question. And look, he's not just being poetic. He really wants us to stop and think about it. What if an atrocity on that scale just faded away, erased from our collective memory?
And here's the thing. This isn't some hypothetical thought experiment. The author grounds his entire argument in this number, 10 to 15 million people. That's the absolutely devastating death toll at the heart of his analysis. So, what exactly is he talking about?
That number brings us to the first part of this breakdown, the historical event at the very center of it all. An event Professor Menza calls a king's forgotten crime.
The place? The Congo Free State. The man in charge? King Leopold II of Belgium. Now here's a really crucial point Menza makes. This was not a Belgian colony in the usual sense. It was the king's personal property, his own private fiefdom, which allowed for a level of exploitation and cruelty that's, well, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around.
And Professor Menza does not pull any punches when he describes this period. He calls it, and this is a direct quote from his work, the apotheosis of European colonial savagery. I mean, that is an incredibly heavy charge, but it's one he backs up with some truly chilling detail.
So what drove all this horror? Simple. Profit. The booming rubber trade, to be exact. And the currency used to enforce it was pure terror, famously symbolized by the severing of hands. The methods were brutal and systematic, forced labor, engineered starvation, and calculated violence that, as the author states, resulted in a death toll of genocidal proportions.
So, a horrific event happened. We've established that. But the core of this explainer, and of Mentz's work, isn't just about what happened back then. It's about how that event is remembered, or not remembered, today. And this brings us right to his central idea, the hypocrisy of memory.
This is really the heart of his thesis. He argues that this forgetting isn't some passive accident, not just the mists of time. He calls it an active, selective memory, and he claims it's a direct function of power. The power to decide which stories get told, which monuments get built, and which victims are actually considered worthy of being remembered.
And here's a perfect example of the contradiction he points to. On one side, you have public statues honoring the architects of that brutal era, still standing in major city squares. On the other side, any official apology for the atrocities is hesitant, full of careful qualifications. It's this stark contrast he calls the theater of remembrance.
Now, to really hammer his point home, Professor Menza takes his argument to its peak. He frames it in a section he calls A Tale of Two Genocides. To make his argument about selective memory impossible to ignore, he doesn't just look at one event in a vacuum. No, he places two immense historical tragedies right next to each other, forcing all of us to confront what he sees as a profound and deeply disturbing double standard.
Just take a look at this comparison he draws. On the left, the Holocaust, and the author is crystal clear that it is rightly enshrined as the ultimate symbol of evil. Its memory is preserved, taught, and defended. But then, on the right, he presents the Congo genocide. There, he argues, the sheer scale of death is often downplayed. The descendants of the victims, they're often told to just move on, or they're accused of dwelling on the past. For Professor Menza, this is the hypocrisy of memory in its starkest form.
That comparison is jarring. It really is. And it raises an immediate, urgent question. Why? Why does this huge discrepancy in our collective memory exist? Well, the author dedicates his next section to answering exactly that, calling it the colonial echo.
So what is the root cause here? How can one history become so sacred while another is treated as if it's almost disposable? This is where Professor Menza moves beyond just describing the problem to diagnosing what he believes is its deep underlying cause.
He introduces this concept he calls mental slavery, and his definition here is so important. He sees it as colonialism's final, most insidious victory, a state where the descendants of the colonized actually internalize the pressure to forget. They effectively become, in his powerful words, the enforcers of their own erasure. He argues that just because these formal systems were legally abolished, their consequences never just vanished. He charts it out as an evolution. Step 1, the systems officially end on paper. But then, step 2, their economic and psychological structures, they don't disappear, they just evolve, hardening into the global inequality we see today. Which brings us to step 3, the present-day legacy of economic drain, conflict fueled by arbitrary borders, and a persistent global dehumanization.
So, once we understand that legacy, that colonial echo, it brings us to the author's final and maybe his most urgent point. If the past is so painful and forgetting is so deeply ingrained, why fight so hard to remember? Why does it matter so much?
According to Professor Mensah, this isn't about assigning blame or dwelling on being a victim. For him, the purpose is clear and profound. First, it's a fight for simple historical truth, just getting the facts straight. Second, it's about restoring the full humanity of those who are systematically dehumanized. And finally, it is a demand for something radical, that all human suffering be given equal weight in our global memory. He boils his entire argument down into this single, powerful statement. For him, you can't build a just present on top of a willfully forgotten, unjust past. The past isn't just the past, it is the very foundation we are all standing on right now. And so, this explainer of Professor Mensah's work leaves us with his final, challenging question. He completely reframes the whole debate. Is insisting on remembering a form of weakness, of dwelling on victimhood? Or, as he powerfully suggests, is it the essential, unavoidable first step toward true liberation? That's a question worth thinking about.